I'm going to tie Herman's Leech. This is a Tiemco 3761 in the size 10. Got a gold bead, 7/16 or an 1/8 inch, and 6/0 groove rod olive thread. Wrap it in all the way back to above the barb of the hook. And bring it back up to, 1 bead's width from the bead. You got a piece of large red wire. I believe this is UTC brand. And nail it down. I'm actually adding some breadth or width to the hook. I want a little breadth to it. And so I'm going to figure eight this piece of wire up to the front and bring it along both sides and then lash it down. You're going to need probably about 6 inches of wire on a size 10 hook. That's where it usually comes out to for me. You might add just a little until you're used to doing that, but that's the best length that I've come up with without having too much waste. I'm going to wrap it to the back, and I'm going to make sure that the wire stays off to the sides. And we're going to use this for the abdomen. It gives it a nice broad surface, and it's a bright red that shines. And so what happens, I think, that the pine squirrel waves across in front of it and gives it what would more life and more movement because of that. I'm taking it all the way to the back. I get kind of picky lashing this down, filling in all the gaps. And you can see I've got quite a bump up there, and I've got that notch. That notch's going to help me for the collar on my fly. Lock it off. I'm just adjusting the wire so it's right off to the sides. You can see what it does. It flattens it out. I think it helps. It gives it that breadth. Now I'm going to take that wire and I'm going to hold those pliers against it and wrap that first wrap so that the edge stays down but comes over and doesn't overlap into it. You can see how close I get to it. Just trying to keep that wire from creeping up over the top of the blade. See, I left that extra notch in there. That's where I'm going to drop my thread into when I tie in my zonker strips, pine squirrel zonker strips. I got quite a bit of pressure on this wire because I'm trying to get the wire to butt up against each other as I wrap concentric circles with it, or concentric wraps. I'm going to bring it up all the way to the bump, maybe a little bit past it, and then tie off behind the bead. As you can see, this fly has a lot of weight on it with the wire and the tungsten bead, and I like to strip it on either a full sink or an intermediate line against the rocks. Been very successful with this fly with the smallies and largemouth. I'm going to tie it off. I've lashed that wire down, and I just helicopter off the excess. And that's the body of my fly. I'm going to drop a little bit of super glue on both sides. I really like to nail down the collar as well as the pine squirrel. So I've taken a piece of pine squirrel that's been zonkered, and it's 5/8 of an inch long. And I'm talking about the actual pelt, the leather side of it. It's 5/8 of an inch long. Take another one and put it on the other side. Wrap it in, tie it off. Cut away my thread. Now I'm going to take a little dab of hand sanitizer, which is basically a gelled alcohol. And I'm going to use it to keep those fibers in place as I try to wrap around it. I like using the alcohol instead of water because I know it's going to evaporate out. Also, it has some natural oils in it, it helps my hands. I go back in and tie my thread in right behind the back, the butt end of it. Cut off that tag end. And I'm going to tie in the back end of the zonker strip right in that notch. So I go one time through the notch, and now I'm going to tie in my zonker strip. And also it makes it easier since it's got that, it's saturated with that hand sanitizer. I can really use my bodkin and find out where I'm matching up the length of that bodkin to the length of the body. And I'm going to use that opening to tie in the end of my pine squirrel strip. All right, now the other side. So as you can see, the intent is to have the pine squirrel on the sides of the fly. And what happens is the tail or the back end of it, I think looks like I think the fish are mistaking this for a teenage crawdad. And when you strip, the tail section looks like two claws trailing behind. And tie off that thread. And then I'm going to take my thread to the middle of that fly, and I'm going to do a wrap, a whip finish or a wrap of thread right in the middle. See, once again, I still have some more of that hand sanitizer to gather my fibers. Now I'm going to use my whip finish. I've split it right here, both at the same time, and now I'm going to wrap at least 3 times, and it's to secure the zonker strips, pine squirrel zonker strips, to the fly. Now I'm going to bring that whip finish and the thread up to the front of the hook. Now I like to make a collar out of olive and rust pine squirrel. If you look at the crawdads, the small crawdads and the big crawdads too in these lakes, they're not one color. They're a general color, but for me, I see, at least in the ones I'm in, they're basically olive, got olive vegetation all over them, and then they've got bits of red in them too. So that's why I use the rust. Put a little 2 strands of flash blue on the side of it. Trim it to the length, actually the tips of the pine squirrel. I'm now going to create a dubbing loop, and I'm going to use pine squirrel once again in tan as well as in rust, and create a collar, create a brush first and use it as a collar on my fly. As you can see, that fly is really variegated with all the dark and light spots. Looks very buggy because of the shadows thrown on by the fibers. In the water, it just really pulses really well, especially when you strip. Now I'm going to capture, I'd say about a half-inch strip of olive pine squirrel and a half-inch strip of rust. I've actually tried to add a little bit more rust into this, so it's a little bit longer piece. trap it in my petitine tool, as you can see in the background, and then I'm going to trim off the leather base or the skin base. And this is one time. More times than not, I'll split the thread and create a brush that way. With this as thick as these materials and as much use as material I'm using, I just create a dubbing loop. It's a better way to go. And that's Mark Petitine's magic tool. You can see being used in the background. Now I have to gauge how much pine squirrel to use so that I get a full collar all the way around. And then I also have to spread it along the bush. I can't let it all pile up together. It won't spin and it won't hold. I'm creating my loop. Got a little turbo twister back there. Lock off my thread for my loop and stick my pine squirrel fibers in that loop, and then spin it so it creates a brush. But you're going to see now, even though those fibers are in, I'm going to make adjustments. None of that goes to waste. So we just add that dubbing onto it, spin it, get that nice variegation with the olive and the mottled olive as well as mottled red. Now I've taken that brush and I've wrapped it around my head of my fly. And what I'm also doing is I'm taking that thread and wrapping it too so I don't lose it. At the beginning I would just wrap the thread and tie it off, and I was still losing the head of the fly. So what I would do is I'd take that extra thread and wrap it around that brush. I'm going to push those fibers back and whip it up to finish the fly. Now you can see that collar on there. You see all that variegation going on with the rust and the olive pine squirrel fibers mixed together. Little bit of flash from the Flashaboo. I'm going to turn off my thread. Now what I like to do is to add a little bead of UV knot sense. What it does is it looks like it's magnified on the brass bead, and it also locks that thread in. And trim off the bottom. Now the one thing I can see is I've got some errant fibers, and what happens when you hit it with UV resin, it just gobs up on those fibers and it doesn't look right. So I'm going to go back in and pull some of those fibers out. And see that little bit of UV resin? Hit it with my laser. I got some errant hairs. And that's what I call my leech. And actually, the inspiration, I watched Charlie Craven tie his cowboy leech one day, and I says, hey, I can do this a little better, and I can make it look a little bit more like something in nature. And this is where this is what I came up with. I was going after a teenage-aged crawdad is what I was looking for. And I always fish this. This is always my lead fly.